Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We apologize for the slight delay. My name is Michelle Feldman, and I'm the State Campaigns Director for the Innocence Project. And we know this is a tough time for everybody, so we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us and be part of this conversation. We have a great panel today to talk about exoneree compensation in Florida and the impact of COVID-19 on exonerees and innocent people who are still behind bars. So first, we'll talk to Clemente Aguirre, who was exonerated after spending 14 years in prison, 10 of them on death row for a double murder in Seminole County that he didn't commit. And Clemente has been denied compensation like so many other Florida exonerees. We also have Seth Miller, who's a director of the Innocence Project of Florida, and he's been on the front lines fighting for the innocent since 2003. And finally, we have Representative Jamie Grant, who represents Hillsborough and Pinellas counties in the Florida House of Representatives. And he's also the chair of the House Criminal Justice Committee. He's been one of our biggest supporters on innocence issues in the state legislature, and he's going to share some tips on the best ways to communicate with your state lawmakers. So first, I'll start with a little overview about Florida's compensation law, and then I'll give you an update about what happened during Florida's legislative session and what the next steps are. So Florida is one of 35 states that has a compensation law for the wrongfully convicted. And these laws are supposed to provide a quick and efficient way for the state to repair the damage of a wrongful conviction. But unfortunately, that's not the way that it's been working in Florida. The law was passed in 2008, and it provides $50,000 for each year that an innocent person was wrongfully incarcerated. And the person has to prove to a judge that they're actually innocent of the crime. But there are so many restrictions in the law that it's excluded most of the people who are supposed to benefit from it. So there have been more than 30 Floridians exonerated since 2008, and only 4 of them have been compensated under the law. So it's pretty obvious that it's not working the way it's supposed to. And exonerees are being forced to rebuild their lives from scratch without any financial assistance. And Clemente is going to talk to us more about what that's like. But taxpayers are also suffering because if an exoneree doesn't get state compensation, the alternative is to file a federal civil rights lawsuit. And these cases take years to resolve, and taxpayers are paying the cost of litigation. And even though it's really hard for exonerees to win, when they do, there's no limit on the amount of awards that they can get. So really the best solution for everyone is to fix the law. And that's what we were trying to do during the Florida session this year. We advocated for a bill that would address 2 major problems. So the first problem is the so-called clean hands bar, which excludes exonerees who had any unrelated convictions from getting compensation. Florida is the only state in the country with this clean hands restriction because it's so inherently unfair. The fact that a person has a criminal record makes them more likely to be wrongfully convicted in the first place because they become one of the usual suspects. And just to highlight how problematic it is, we have a client who was barred from being compensated for the 25 years that he was wrongfully convicted because during that time he escaped from prison, but he never should have been in prison in the first place. So the clean hands bar was really controversial when it passed in the original law, and it's time to remove it once and for all. The second problem is the filing deadline. It just doesn't mirror the exoneration process. So there's really 2 steps to exonerate someone. First, the judge overturns their conviction, and second, the prosecutor gets to decide to either dismiss the charges or to retry the person. And in Clemente's case, the Florida Supreme Court overturned his conviction in 2016 with really strong evidence, including DNA, that showed that he didn't commit the crime. But the prosecutor decided to retry him. And the current law says that you have to file for compensation within 3 months of the date that the conviction was overturned. But at that point, Clemente was still behind bars as he was waiting for his new trial. So the filing deadline needs to be fixed to reflect the actual exoneration process. So this year, here's what happened in the legislative session. The good news is that we got closer than ever to fixing the law. And that's because people in Florida made hundreds of calls to their state lawmakers. And we really appreciate all your support. It made a huge difference. We also had some great legislative champions. The bill passed 6 committees unanimously, which is really a record. There was not a single no vote, but ultimately the bill got combined with other criminal justice issues, and that really led to the full House and the full Senate running out of time to pass it before the session adjourned on March 2nd. So it's really disappointing we didn't get over the finish line, but the good news is we have a solid foundation to build support on. And the next session starts in March of 2021, but now is really when the work gets done. It's the best time to start working with your state lawmakers and start talking to them about this issue. And 2020 is an election year, so state lawmakers are especially concerned about what issues matter to their constituents. And we'll get into that in more detail with Representative Grant, but here's just a few tools for connecting with your lawmakers. So first, you'll see that we have a link on Facebook where you could sign up for alerts on the bill. And you can be directly connected to your state representative and state senator through phone, email, or Twitter. You could also look up who your senator and representative is on the Florida legislature's website. It's really helpful to know if your senators and representatives are on one of the committees that will be voting on the bill, which again, you could see by clicking on that link. Another tip is to get started early. The real successful bills have momentum well ahead of the beginning of session, and there are committees that have interim meetings before March, before the actual session begins. And finally, the more personalized that you make your outreach, the more impact it will have. So phone calls and in-person meetings are the most effective. It might be difficult to do in person right now, but certainly phone calls would work. And you really want to remind your lawmaker that you're a constituent and you care about the exoneree compensation issue, and make that personal connection about why you care about the issue, and ask them how they're going to work to support that effort in 2021. So now I'm going to turn to Clemente, who could talk more about the importance of fixing the compensation law and the challenges that exonerees are facing during the COVID-19 crisis. And just an introduction about Clemente's case. Clemente was exonerated in November of 2018. He spent 14 years in prison and 10 years on death row for a double homicide in Seminole County when he was innocent. Clemente is currently living in Tampa, and he's made several trips to Tallahassee to advocate for different innocence issues. So Clemente, let's get a little bit into your case. When you heard the guilty verdict and you found out that you were sentenced to death for a crime that you didn't commit, what did you feel in that moment?
I couldn't believe it. I am innocent. I was innocent then. And there was no real evidence against me. Everything was circumstantial. And I had so much faith in the system that I thought the truth will come out then, but it didn't.
And what was it like to be on death row?
Wow. Different world. You don't have the opportunity of education. You don't have the opportunity to work. They can hide you from the world, family, friends, lawyers. They just leaving you right there, forgotten, just to be executed.
And then how were you finally exonerated?
DNA evidence, thanks to the Innocence Project, I was able to test the DNA, and it came out, the results came out like I was just saying all along. My DNA was not found in the crime scene, was somebody else, and we also find out that this person whose DNA we found had confessed on a videotape and to multiple people.
Wow. And the Florida Supreme Court overturned your conviction in 2016. Most people think that that's the end and you're exonerated, but that's not what happened in your case. Can you explain what happened next?
No, almost in every case is the same. I mean, the state attorney had the power to appeal or retrial you for that same crime. So, prosecutors decide to try me for the crime again. So even though I was considered a scapegoat of the crime to this person, I was still going to trial for it.
And that really ties into why you were denied compensation. The law says that you have 90 days to file, starting from the date that the court overturns the conviction. But at that point, you were still in jail because the prosecutor was going to try you for the same crime. And finally, the prosecutor did dismiss the charges 2 years later. And at that point, you filed for compensation, but the judge was forced to deny it because it was too late. What did that feel like? What was your reaction when you found out that you couldn't be compensated?
I was very disappointed. I mean, I had, like I say, I had read the statute too, and it says also say that you are trial for the same crime or being considered a suspect of it, you cannot apply for compensation. Even the judge say that. I mean, they leave it for interpretation, and I don't know what to take it from here. I don't know how to take it from here. I was really, really disappointed because I had nothing to start with.
And what did you think when you found out that almost no Florida exonerees have been compensated under the law?
I'm very surprised, disappointed, because I think if you write a certain statute in the law, it should be to be helping this particular set of people or group of people. And yet I find out that only a third of people is being compensated and the other two-thirds hasn't. So what good is having to have a law and it doesn't help the people it's supposed to help?
Right. And so you just got your freedom a little over a year ago, and now you're being quarantined. What does that feel like?
I'm not going to lie to you. It brings you back to the place that you were into back then when you were locked up for real. I guess it's because all the mental issues we exonerees have to be there for so long in isolation, right? But it brings you back to that mindset of vulnerability and sadness that you cannot see the people you want to see when you want to see them.
Right. And what would you say are additional challenges that exonerees like you who haven't been compensated are facing in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? Things were already tough. How do you think that this pandemic is going to affect, wrongfully convicted people like you?
Well, a few points on that. A lot of people have get out of jail without nothing, right? And they looking for a job after they've been exonerated. But if an employer run your name or Google your name and it appears that you were convicted for a violent crime, it's very unlikely that they give you a job, even though you've been exonerated for it. You rely on some kind of generosity, help from family, friends, organizations. But everybody's struggling now. A lot of people is being laid off from work. They are not allowed to work because they have to be in a certain set of the, as a lot of people going to be close by. And we exonerees have to be really, really careful, more than anybody, I guess, because we do not have health insurance. Once you get out of jail, you get out without nothing, right? So going to a hospital or something like that, they will provide you with a lot of debt that you don't want. And like I say, many exonerees already have health issues prior to this, and this just come and affect us more. So we have to be really, really careful in what we do.
And this question is from a reporter at the Orlando Sentinel. Related to that, after spending so many years in prison, what are your concerns about the COVID-19 impact on Florida's prisons? And have you been talking to any of your friends who are still in prison? And what are you hearing from them?
I had two friends. We write each other. I make sure that I'm able to write them. And But to your first part of the question, I'm going to be honest with you. When I first thought of it, because I was there and I know how the medical system work in prison, I was really sad because I know as many, I myself went through some minor thing that become so big because they don't want to give me the attention to it. Hepatitis C, they don't want to give you treatment for it. So I cannot imagine what the people in there will go through it being so close by together, because prison in Florida is a lot of people in it, right? So I had received a letter from a friend. He told me 3 people had died in death row. I don't know exactly who. They didn't want to say why they died for. It's just what they died. So I'm very concerned, very sad about them. My prayers go to all of them because I know the system there is not the best that we can have. Right.
Right. And on a more hopeful note, and a little happier note, how do you feel that so many people in Florida reached out to their state lawmakers and asked them to support fixing the compensation law this year?
I'm very, very proud of my Floridian citizens because, it has take a lot of effort. I didn't know how much effort in work to take from people. I've been going to Tallahassee like 7 times. I have been going up there to talk to legislators and senators. And, when I talked in college, I have to speak with law students. I had talked to attorneys, public defenders, and senators in the same way. And everybody is like very surprising that the state of Florida has so many exoneration or so many wrongly convictions. So they see something wrong in the law and they trying to fix it. And I'm very, very proud. And I think that we keep the hard work, we're going to make it there.
Definitely. And that's a really hopeful message. And just the last thing I want to ask you is, hopefully people who are listening today will be part of the effort and contact their state lawmakers and ask them to fix the law. What do you want them to know about your story, and what do you want them to take from your story and convey to their lawmakers?
Well, a lot of people don't have that knowledge of what really is going on in the prison system. And when they hear my story, they read, they really surprised of what is going on in the system. And they ask themselves, how is possible that we have wrongly convict these people, but yet don't compensate them? I mean, the state of Florida, what they do to wrongly convicted people is torture, right? It's no other word to describe it. You are not just taking a birthday from me, a hug, a few tears, or a few Christmas. You taken from us life as we know it. No longer things are the way they were when we were in there. By the time we get out, and we get out without nothing. So it should be a compensation. If you wrongly convict somebody, you should make it right, trying to make it right. It shouldn't be that difficult to make it right.
Absolutely. And we have one last question quickly from Sarah from Fort Lauderdale, who's joining us today. And she asked, did you have a public defender or private counsel at your original trial?
A public defender.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Clemente. And I'm sure we'll get more questions at the end. But now I'm going to turn to Seth Miller. Seth is the director of the Innocence Project of Florida, which he's founded in 2003. And he's been working for years to change the compensation law. And he's also seeing the impact of COVID-19 on clients who are innocent and are still behind bars. So Seth, most Florida exonerees have been barred from getting compensation. What has it been like for you to have to tell your clients that after all the years they lost, they can't be compensated because of the deadline or the clean hands provision?
Thanks, Michelle. So many of our clients have been in prison for 10 or 20 or 30 or even 40 years for crimes they didn't commit. And in order to get through that kind of long-term incarceration as an innocent person, the person has a lot of struggles, a lot of fights in order to finally find that vindication. And the hope is that when they are vindicated, that is the end of the struggle, that they can move on and have a good, long, healthy life in freedom. And so it's very difficult to tell them that after all those many years of struggles, there is still more struggle, more legal struggle to try to get the kind of recompense that they deserve. And it's really difficult for them because, a lot of them have been in prison for so long, particularly the older individuals, either because they have health problems, because of their age, don't have the ability to work. They haven't built up those Social Security credits so they can get Social Security when they become a senior citizen. And they're really reliant, or would be reliant, on that compensation to help them get through the rest of the years that they have on Earth and find some stability. So it's a really hard thing to hear, but I will say that most of our clients, far from being angry, are good-natured about it and do like Clemente does, with try to come to Tallahassee and fight for that compensation, not just for themselves, but for the rest of the folks who've been exonerated and all those people that will be exonerated.
And what do you see as the impact that not being compensated has on exonerees, and what do you think it's going to be like them in this new world we're living in with COVID-19?
Well, first, our goals at the Innocence Project of Florida and at many innocence organizations are not just to get innocent people out of prison, but to also help them transition back into a society that's totally different from the one they left years before. And in order to have a good, solid, successful transition, our goal is to create stability, health stability, make sure they can put food on the table, family stability, but also financial stability, because we know when people have that kind of instability, it creates all kinds of struggles that leads to undermining them having the success after they're released from their wrongful incarceration. So certainly having compensation will help in doing that. Now, this is particularly acute in a time of this coronavirus, COVID-19, because our clients that can work, who haven't been compensated, some of them aren't working. Like, for example, we have a client who is a long distance trucker. We helped him get his CDL license, and he now has a very good paying job at moving cargo all around the state of Florida and around the country. And he is not able to get the hours and have the work that he had before COVID-19. And he's someone who has been barred by the Clean Hands provision from being compensated. So there's a direct nexus between, the confluence between the pandemic and his lack of compensation and what now is a good bit of instability. We have a client, Dean McKee, who, opened a tattoo shop within a year of him being exonerated, and it was really starting to build his business. But now in the era of COVID-19, his shop is closed like many other businesses because he can't see clients in order to tattoo them. He doesn't have a way to make money, and therefore doesn't have a way to pay for his health insurance, which makes it all the more problematic if he were to contract the virus. So these are really, really tough times for folks who have been exonerated, even for the ones that have been doing well since they've been exonerated.
And Seth, you also have innocent clients who are still behind bars, and you're in the process of working to get them out. What has it been like for them, and how is COVID-19 impacting them in prison?
Well, it's very, very, very complicated. We represent about 30 people in prison around the state of Florida who all have viable claims of innocence, and some of them are near the end of that process. They're ready to get out of prison, but the courts have essentially been closed because of COVID-19. While we were on this Facebook Live, we just found out that the Florida Supreme Court has suspended all proceedings until June. And so our clients both are concerned about resolving their cases and getting out, but also concerned that in the time that they remain in, awaiting this pandemic to abate, that they're going to get sick and not have an opportunity to vindicate themselves and in this life. And I think that's a serious concern for anyone who knows anything about how prisons are operated and how close people are together and how many people are there. It's a concern both for the folks who are prisoners there, as well for the staff and the administration who work in the prison.
And of course, we know inside the prisons, it's almost impossible to social distance. There's not really access to basic cleaning materials and soap and all the things that we're advised to do to stay healthy. So I know that the Innocence Project of Florida recently signed a letter to the governor asking for the Department of Corrections to take some steps and respond to COVID-19. What do you think that the Department of Corrections should be doing?
That's true, Michelle. We did last week issue a letter along with our friends at the Florida Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers to Governor DeSantis and Secretary of Department of Corrections Inch. And we laid out a bunch of facts about COVID-19 and the threat to both prisoners as well as staff in these facilities. And we provided 15 recommendations for what can be done to prevent the spread of the virus and mitigate its impact on the people who are in these facilities. And it really focuses on three things. The first is allowing for release of individuals who either are in for very low-level crimes, and this is both in jails and prisons, people who are very old and have certain medical conditions, providing more access to conditional medical release, and allowing people who are very close to the end of their sentences to get out now so they don't contract the virus right before they're about to get out. And the whole point of those efforts are to sort of lessen the population in the prison so that the prisons and jails can at least try to maximize the ability to take some of the efforts to social distance, to have better hygiene. We've asked for greater access to, it's very simple things, greater access to soap and cleaning supplies, which up to this point, folks would have to buy from the commissary. We've asked them to provide them for free, provide paid sick leave to staff so they don't have to come to work when they're sick. These types of things that can help prevent spread of the virus and then mitigate its spread for the people who will remain there. And lastly, we've asked for just greater transparency about what's actually going on in the prisons. And since our letter, the DOC has put up statistics on their website for everyone to see. And it's our hope that they will continue to update them daily so that both the public and policymakers can know what's going on. So we can, as a community, take steps to keep both prisoners and staff in the prison safe.
Great. Thank you so much, Seth. And I just wanted to respond to one of the questions I'm seeing on Facebook, asking how many people have gotten compensated. So just to reiterate, it's only 4 of over 30 exonerees in Florida that have actually gotten compensated through the law. Some other people have gotten private bills and they've gotten compensated that way, but that's a really difficult process. It means that the individual has to get a lawmaker to file compensation just for them, and it has to pass the legislature and be signed by the governor. And it's really counter to what the exoneree compensation law, the universal law, is supposed to do, which is provide a uniform and efficient process for anybody that can prove that they were wrongfully convicted and that they're actually innocent to be compensated. So thank you for that question. And finally, I'm going to turn to Representative Jamie Grant. Representative Grant was elected to the Florida House of Representatives in 2015, and his district includes Pinellas and Hillsborough counties, and he's also chair of the House Criminal Justice Committee. So Representative Grant, thank you for being here today. And what is your job like being the chair of the House Criminal Justice Subcommittee?
Thanks for having me, Michelle. I think the shortest answer to that is mass chaos. Oftentimes, it's a chairmanship that a lot of people love to have. It's been one that's been exciting for the last probably 5 or 6 terms. When you look at the policy that's been moving in some of the national debates we've had to have, and as somebody who ran for office to tackle tough challenges and to kind of mix it up in the arena and solve difficult challenges. Being the chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee is certainly a challenge. What that effectively means, aside from member bills that I'd run myself or my policy that I work on outside of our judiciary silo, I'm responsible for setting the criminal justice agenda. So bills that are going to be heard or bills that are not going to be heard, amending, creating proposed committee substitutes, which are that's a way for us as a committee to say, hey, look, we like the idea you're working with, but we think it needs some work. And so So we're going to work on it. And so I'm responsible for setting the agenda. I'm responsible for kind of being a gatekeeper to make sure bad policy doesn't move, to ensure that we move good policy that is significant reform. And typically that means I have a spreadsheet of somewhere between probably 300 to 400 bills by the time session's done, that are all referred to my committee, that we've got to decide what we're going to do with those and what we're going to prioritize. A lot of times, and it's a good thing that we're a part-time legislature, but a lot of times it's a function of time, right? It's what is going to be a priority, how much committee time is that going to take, and can we make sure we get that moved out, and then get to as much good policy as we can from there.
And you've been championing fixing the compensation law for a long time. What first got you interested in the issue?
I think really two things. One, I first started, you were talking about kind of the private compensation bill. We call them claim bills here in Florida. I was a chairman of a select committee on the claim bill process to try and reform it because, quite frankly, it's a pretty grotesque process. It really depends on who you know and who you can hire and who's in the speaker's office and who's in the president's office and all of those different things when you talk about waiving sovereign immunity to pay somebody. And that can happen for a lot of things, not just wrongful incarceration. So trying to reform the claim bill process was one. But then two, a lot of the work y'all and the Facto folks have done, whether it's a guy like Brian Tannenbaum, that's a very dear friend, or some of the folks of the Innocence Project who have been working on a number of things between Facto and the Innocence Project to highlight the gravest injustice we can see in society. And you're probably tired of me saying this, Michelle, but the gravest injustice we see is when government behind a badge or a gun takes somebody's life or liberty. And Clemente said it well, right? You look at somebody like Clemente, he was facing the loss of his life, not just his freedom, but the loss of his life. And then on the backside of it has to ask, what's the point of a law if it doesn't help the people it's supposed to help? And so to me, when we think about what our priorities are going to be in the criminal justice space, step one, and all of our priority should be focused on people who have had their life or their liberty taken for something they did not commit. And that's really why we put such an emphasis on this over the 2 years I've been fortunate to be the chair here.
And the exoneree compensation bill had a lot of great support this session. It passed multiple committees unanimously, but it ultimately didn't get through the Senate and the House floor. What do you think happened?
Look, this is a really ugly process. And I joke with people sometimes that you come up to Tallahassee or Washington, D.C., and you see how the sausage is made and you want to order bacon the rest of your life, because the sausage making process can be pretty ugly. What happened here is that there were certain lobbyists who paint themselves as criminal justice reform lobbyists that are out there under really kind of one or two issues typically. And because the total package didn't have their issue in it. So if we weren't going to do anything on minimum mandatories, then they were going to fight against us. Or if we weren't going to do anything on retroactive sentencing, they were going to fight against us. And what they ultimately did was put their efforts behind killing not just this bill. When you look at what we prioritized from the chairmanship out of this committee, number one was the Clean Hands bill. Number two was the multiple components of it, I should say, right? So not just the fact that, and you touched on it earlier, Michelle, but somebody who has a prior conviction is much more likely to be convicted wrongfully than somebody who did not. Number two was the timeline. And I think maybe a simpler way to really help drive home for people to understand how offensive that current law is that it puts somebody in a position of potentially testifying against themselves. Somebody would have to choose whether or not they want to put testimony on the record to prove their innocence to get compensated, while a prosecutor is still determining whether or not they want to retry that person. And in this country, not only should you never be locked up when you haven't been when you haven't committed the crime, but number two, you should never be put in a situation of risking your life or liberty testifying against yourself. And so that was there. But then three, we looked at it and we said, well, look, we had buy-in for the prospective stuff moving forward, but we didn't have maybe buy-in on the retrospective. And what I said as the chairman was two things. Number one, I don't care at what point in time somebody was wrongfully incarcerated, having their life or their liberty jeopardized by government. We're going to pay them if they have met the threshold of being exonerated. And then number two, we're going to pay them on the premise that they get paid for every single day they are wrongfully incarcerated. And so that was kind of the way we looked at it. But inside that package, when you look at the end of session, not only did we have all of that on the Clean Hands bill, we had something that I prioritized, and a reporter back in Tampa kind of put the Tommy Ziegler case on my radar. I think y'all are familiar with it a little bit. But that's a case where access to DNA evidence probably either confirms the conviction or proves Tommy's innocence. And so we looked at it across 2 years, and really I put several staff attorneys on coming up with an organic way that we can reduce the burden for somebody who's in prison, like a Clemente. I mean, his case is spot on. If Clemente couldn't get access to the DNA evidence, he's still on death row, or worse, he's been executed. And so we have a lot of people in prison today who were convicted on what I call junk science, and we ought to make it more accessible to test that evidence, to increase the credibility of convictions or get wrongfully incarcerated people out of prison. That was in that package. And then lastly, some significant, primarily juvenile, not as far as I wanted to go, but significant seal and expunge policy. All of that was in that package that several people went to war on and tried to kill on the last night, not understanding the calendar. They got the bill sponsor to think that there were some problems with the bill from our side, which couldn't have been further from the truth. I don't know that we could have done more to put that bill on a tee to head over to the Senate and ultimately get to the governor. And so it's frustrating, but in this process, you kind of learn that it's never done till it's done, and you got to be willing to come back and work on it next year. And I'm probably more committed than I've ever been, especially after the way this session ended, because whether it's Clemente or anybody else, nobody deserves a fate or a peril that is predicated on people's egos or their misunderstanding of the law or the process. And it's long past time that we get this fixed.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so on that note, what do you recommend that people who are listening now, what do you recommend that they say or do to really communicate with their lawmakers and, get them to advocate for this reform?
So I think it's a great question. And I think it depends. One of the things I always tell people in the advocacy space is that every one of my colleagues is either up here because they know what they want to do or what they want to be called. And advocating to those two different groups is very, very, very different. The good news here is that this is an issue that cuts across all ideologies, all parties. It's something, as you mentioned, that didn't have a single no vote on it. And I think the reason for that is pretty simply, when you look at the conservative end of the spectrum, people tend to identify with the liberties being denied here. When you look at the liberal end of the spectrum, that group has largely been on the decarceration path prior to the First Step Act and some of the things we've seen with criminal justice reform getting more and more attention. But you have an issue that really touches on kind of all sides. So I always stress, know who you're talking to and what matters to them, right? If it's somebody who is just up here because they want a title, then sure, they're scared of their reelection. They're scared of the consequences. And so it's important to let them know that you're a constituent. It's important to let them know that you're going to be paying attention and generating votes, and you'd like them to be on your side when it comes to that cause. When it comes to somebody who knows what they want to get done, they typically don't get moved by threats. They typically don't get moved by fear. They get moved by good public policy. And so it's important to kind of have the facts and to know what you're talking about and to be accurate. I'll say that one of the biggest challenges, and you and I have had this conversation, Seth and I have talked about it, one of the biggest challenges I've had in now 6 or 7 years of working on criminal justice reform is just the amount of misinformation. And it seems like every year a different issue is raised, and people just fundamentally either misstate facts or don't understand the law. And all of a sudden, hundreds of or thousands of calls and emails are going, and they're just wrong. They're just factually wrong. And so it becomes very difficult to make public policy reforms predicated on bad facts. Bad facts always make bad law. And so that's really the biggest challenge. And so I would say just be engaged, be aware, know your stuff, and know what matters to the legislator you're talking to as far as what they care about and why they're there.
That's really great advice. And just to shift gears a little bit, so do you have any updates or things that you'd like to see the Department of Corrections do in light of the COVID-19 pandemic in prisons?
Yeah, so biggest update I've got is I have a staff director who's about 8.5 months pregnant. And so Whitney and I are both kind of anxiously waiting some return correspondence and some answers from the Department of Corrections. What I will say in meeting with Secretary Inch a couple times this week and just updating with him, I know that the department is trying to do what it can with what I think is a really tough situation. I mean, the reality is this is a pandemic inside of prison. It's a pandemic outside of prison. It's a public health crisis. It's an economic disaster. I'm not sure we've ever seen anything like this in our lifetime. And so how we kind of navigate through it, I think, requires a level of calm and cool and strategic thought to make sure that we're not overreacting, but also to make sure that we're not underappreciating the dangers around us from a public health perspective. And so I do have the utmost of confidence in Secretary Edge and hope that they will continue down the path that he's been headed. But we're still kind of in a wait and see pattern with some of the specifics we've asked about.
Great. And we just have one last question, which is from somebody who's participating on Facebook Live. So what is the best way to hold actors accountable when they are part of a wrongful conviction, including prosecutors and even the lawmakers who don't support these innocence reforms?
So you and I think, talked about this the first time we met in my district office a couple of years ago. I think a prosecutor who commits a Brady violation that leads to a conviction ought to lose their pension. I think that they ought to have the same liability as somebody that was wrongfully convicted. At the end of the day, when somebody has the gun or the badge, the more powerful and authoritarian government becomes, the more cases we see where somebody's wrongfully convicted or somebody's wrongfully put to death at the extreme end. And then we watch all of the watered down or less significant denials of liberty throughout. And so to me, a prosecutor or a judge, somebody who has the badge, who has the gun, and who maliciously and knowingly denies the production of evidence that would lead to a question on the conviction or to decrease the likelihood of a conviction, there's no punishment that I personally wouldn't support. Now, the bad news, I don't know that I have as much buy-in up here from people who probably get scared to take on law enforcement or state attorneys or judges when there's been bad actors. But the truth, I think, at the end of the day, always, in my experience up here, is that no one group is fully made up of good actors, and no one group is made up of fully bad actors across, whether it's the criminal justice system or in the civil justice system or the education system, healthcare. You can go everywhere. We're going to find good and bad actors. We ought to be holding bad actors accountable. And to me, a prosecutor or a judge who knowingly and willfully tries to wrongfully incarcerate or convict, incarcerate and execute somebody, there's no punishment that I'd feel sympathy for them suffering.
Thank you so much, Representative Grant. We really appreciate your advice. And we have a question for Clemente, a two-part question. So, Clemente, what has been the best part about being out? What are some of the highs, and what have been some of the toughest challenges since you've been exonerated?
Well, I'm free. That should be a highlight. I have a dog now. I have a girlfriend. So, I am trying to interact with people. I cook my own food. So that is the plus side, the highlight. I was able to see my mother in Christmas in Hawker. They give her a visa so she come and visit me. I have seen my sisters. I hadn't meet the rest of the family, but I eventually, hopefully, I'm going to do it soon. The law is all this, right? There's no opportunities. I got stuck somewhere 15 years ago where technology changed, where it wasn't iPhones, where it was a flip phone. And when I got a prison, the first thing they give me is a FaceTime with the son of my lawyer. And I'm like, oh my God, I have seen pictures, but I can believe I'm seeing you face to face. So I've been struggling a lot with technology. I'm not there yet, but it's baby steps. I think it's going to get better.
Absolutely. And one last question, Clemente, another question from Facebook. So what is your dream? Like, what do you hope in the future that you can do? I know you were thinking about going to cooking school. You've been advocating in Tallahassee. Can you talk about some of that?
Yeah, like a representative was saying, it's a lot of misconception or misinformation from people. Or maybe because they don't read, or maybe because they have never come across in the path somebody they been through these struggles, or they don't know nobody like that, right? So my dream has always been a cook. I don't know. I make people happy. They make them smile. You moody, now you happy. Things like that. But after all these years that I've been going up there and see what is behind the scenes, how much work we still got to do. For now, I want to keep on doing this and advocating for the wrongly convicted, for the people who were wrong, for the people that I know is still dead and is innocent, for myself. Because I believe if we make somebody accountable or for wrongly convict somebody or wrongly execute somebody, it will be a better persecution. But it's nothing out there right now. They make them give a better persecution because they got 100% immunity. So, you know, I would like that to change. So for now, this is what I'm going to be doing as much as I can until I'm able to go and fulfill my dream.
Thank you, Clemente. And I want to just end on a final question for Clemente, because we are all in this uncertain time and people are really looking for some hope, and nobody knows better than you how to keep hope and how to keep faith. How did you manage to do that for all those years?
I pray and I pray like it was not tomorrow. I know a lot of people don't believe in religion. I know a lot of people don't believe in God or different gods or don't believe in Jesus, or they do. I ain't here to preach you. I'm just telling you that I pray with all my heart and all my soul. And I believe what I was praying on. And I thought it's going to be better. Even though when things get hard, that how many times I was denied a new trial, I pray again. God, believe me, I was devastated. I was sad. I was crying. I was infuriated. All these kind of things, they come into a human being, but eventually teach me patience. So all we have to do right now is patient and believe that things are going to be better, because the tunnel don't last forever, right? There's always light at the end of it. So I believe we're going to make it to the other side of the tunnel. Just let's do what we're supposed to do, and we're going to be all right.
Well, that's really the perfect note to end on. And again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this important conversation. Thank you to all our panelists for joining in. If you want to learn more about Clemente's story, he is on the Wrongful Conviction podcast, and we will send a link so you can listen. And we will also be answering more questions if you want to keep them coming on Facebook Live. And again, thank you everyone for your time. And we look forward to continuing working for compensation. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
All right.